October 1944, Lorraine, France. Cold rain hammered against the canvas roof of a dimly lit field court-martial tent. Inside, the air smelled of soaked wool, cigarette smoke, and thick battlefield mud. Before we continue, we indulge you to subscribe. We tell the WWII story about true stories behind the before WWII myth. A battle-worn combat sergeant stood silently at attention, his face hollow from months at the front. Across from him sat a sharply dressed captain whose boots were polished spotless and whose understanding of war came only from paperwork and regulations. The captain tapped a stack of military documents on the desk before him. He demanded a formal trial. To him, a simple act of compassion was nothing less than theft of government property. The sergeant said nothing. His mind was somewhere else, inside the dark basement of a ruined French village. He remembered the terrified faces of two starving children and their mother who had gone nearly 3 days without food. He remembered handing over his own rations without hesitation. Now a military lawyer who had never stepped foot in combat wanted to strip him of his rank for it. But General George S. Patton was already on his way. And before the night ended, the famous commander would teach that lawyer the difference between a soldier who fights wars and a man who only studies rules. This is the story of the moment a decorated combat sergeant nearly faced court-martial for feeding a starving French family during World War II. Before we continue, make sure to subscribe. We bring you the untold World War II stories that reveal the human reality behind the legends of war. Moments where military law collided with the brutal truths of the battlefield. Sergeant Frank Morales was 30 years old and came from San Antonio, Texas. He served as an infantry squad leader in Patton's Third Army. Morales had earned 2 Bronze Stars and a Purple Heart through some of the fiercest fighting in Europe. He was respected by his men because he led from the front and understood that war was measured in lives, not paperwork. During the Allied push through Lorraine, Morales and his squad were clearing the shattered remains of a bombed village when he discovered a hidden cellar beneath a collapsed building. Inside were Marie Dupont and her 2 young children. They were weak from hunger, wrapped in thin blankets against the freezing cold. Their faces were pale, and their bodies showed clear signs of starvation. Morales didn't hesitate. Without asking permission, he removed every ration from his pack and handed it to the family. He gave them water from both of his canteens. At that moment, he acted not as a soldier following regulations, but as a human being refusing to watch innocent people die. Captain Alvin Driscoll saw the situation very differently. Driscoll was a 35-year-old legal officer from Washington, D.C. His uniform was always perfectly pressed, his desk perfectly organized, and his understanding of war came entirely from military law books. Unlike Morales, Driscoll had never fought in combat. He had never endured artillery fire, watched men bleed out in the mud, or gone hungry at the front. To him, discipline was absolute. In only 3 months overseas, Driscoll had already filed dozens of disciplinary actions against soldiers for even the smallest violations. Dirty rifles, missing buttons, unshined boots. He carried a leather-bound military justice manual everywhere and treated it like sacred scripture. When he heard what Morales had done, he didn't see mercy. He saw theft. By the autumn of 1944, Patton's rapid advance across France had slowed into a miserable struggle through rain, mud, and collapsing supply lines. Every ration mattered. Military regulations clearly forbade soldiers from giving supplies to civilians under any circumstances. Most frontline officers quietly ignored these rules when starving civilians were involved. They understood the reality of war. But men like Driscoll, far from the battlefield, believed regulations mattered more than context. Inside the legal tent, Captain Driscoll stared coldly at Sergeant Morales while preparing the official court-martial paperwork. Soon afterward, Captain Miller, Morales's exhausted company commander, entered the tent covered in mud from the front lines. "I need to talk about Sergeant Morales," Miller said firmly. Without even looking up from his paperwork, Driscoll replied, "You mean the man who stole Army property?" Miller clenched his jaw. "He fed starving children," he answered, "using his own rations." Driscoll adjusted his glasses calmly. Regulations do not distinguish between personal discretion and government-issued supplies. Miller stared at him in disbelief. "That man has earned 2 Bronze Stars," he snapped. "He's one of the best combat leaders I've got." Driscoll stood and straightened his jacket. "The principle matters more than the quantity involved." Miller shook his head slowly. "You've never seen what war does to people." Driscoll tapped the military law book on his desk. "The law is what separates order from chaos." "No," Miller replied coldly. "Men like Morales are." Miller refused to support the charges, but Driscoll pushed the case forward anyway. Within hours, the court-martial request landed on General Patton's desk. Patton reviewed the report in silence. He examined Morales's combat record, then looked at the name of the officer filing the complaint. Without saying a word, he ordered his driver to prepare the Jeep. The general intended to see this situation personally. Rain poured heavily as Patton's vehicle arrived outside the legal tent. The moment he stepped inside, every soldier snapped to attention. Patton ignored the salutes. His eyes locked immediately onto Captain Driscoll. "Is this the complaint against Sergeant Morales?" Patton asked. "Yes, sir," Driscoll replied confidently. "A clear case of misuse of military property." Patton flipped through the paperwork slowly. "You filed 47 disciplinary actions in 3 months?" "Yes, sir. Discipline is essential." Patton looked up sharply. "How many Germans have you killed since arriving in France, Captain?" The tent fell silent. Driscoll opened his mouth but had no answer. Patton slammed the file onto the desk. "You sit in dry tents quoting regulations, while men like Morales freeze and bleed in the mud," Patton growled. "That sergeant spent months risking his life for this army. He found starving civilians and gave away his own food. That's not weakness, that's character." Patton stepped closer. "You think law exists to crush humanity? I think law exists to protect it." Then the general gave Driscoll a choice. Either burn the charges immediately and apologize to Sergeant Morales, or be transferred directly to a frontline rifle company to learn what war truly looked like. Driscoll's hands trembled as he lit a lighter beneath the charge sheet. The court-martial papers slowly curled into ash. Patton watched silently. Then he issued a new order across the Third Army. Soldiers would be permitted to share personal rations with starving civilians at their own discretion. Such actions would no longer be treated as disciplinary violations. Sergeant Morales stood silently as the burden finally lifted from his shoulders. Word of Patton's decision spread rapidly through the camps. Frank Morales survived the war and returned home to Texas in 1945. He rarely spoke about combat afterward. Instead, he spent decades working as a history teacher and football coach. Every day, he quietly carried extra sandwiches to school for hungry students, never asking for recognition. Captain Driscoll returned to Washington after the war, still convinced discipline mattered more than mercy. He spent the rest of his life behind office desks, never fully understanding the men who fought on the front lines. Patton himself rarely mentioned the incident publicly, but years later, among his private papers, historians discovered a short handwritten note. "A leader must sometimes break a small rule to save a great soul." To this day, historians still debate whether Patton's actions strengthened military leadership or dangerously weakened discipline. But for the soldiers who fought in the mud of Lorraine, the lesson was unforgettable. War could destroy a man's humanity if he allowed it. If you had been in Patton's position, what would you have done? Would you have upheld the military regulations regardless of the cost? Let us know in the comments. And if you want more stories about the truth behind the myths of military glory, make sure to subscribe. And on that cold night in 1944, Sergeant Frank Morales chose to keep his.